in particular for having me here and giving me an opportunity to share my research with some of the leading scholars in the field. It's a big privilege and honor. I was even more eager to participate in this conference because I'm working on something like a critical history of Marathi literature. And it's not very often that you meet your bibliography. And the who's who of the people, the leading experts in the field, and so it's very exciting. I want to thank Philip in particular, and also express my regards for his retired life. But I want to also draw your attention to very un-Marathi quality of Philip. How can a person be so gentle? You heard about Raj Thackeray and Bal Thackeray. That's normal. That's very surprising. I will begin my presentation with a poem in Marathi and its translation. The poem reads like this. The poem is इंग्रजी काव्य वाचन मुंबई. भिंतीवरल्या मादाम ब्लॅवॅट्स्कीच्या दयेशील नजरेखाली बसलेली 20-25 माणसं. भिंतीवरल्या मादाम ब्लॅवॅट्स्कीच्या दयेशील नजरेखाली बसलेली 20-25 माणसं. काही स्लीवलेस दंड, काही कुर्ते जीन्सवाले, 8-10 पारशी स्त्री चेहरे. बहुतेक सारे कफ परेड ते मलबार हिलच्या आवाक्यातले. शहरातला ज्येष्ठ इंडो इंग्लिश कवी ओळख करून देतो मुलायम शब्दात पाहुण्या ब्रिटिश कवीची, जो मग उठून जड डोळ्यांनी वाचू लागतो आपल्या कविता, अधून मधून रोचक गप्पा गोष्टी करत सराईतपणे. हनुविटीवर मूठ ठेवून स्त्री चेहरे ऐकतात उत्सुकतेने. कवी वाचतो संथ मृदू आवाजात. कुठे हे आणि कुठे ते भारतीय भाषेतले कवी जे ढाल्या आवाजात हातवारा करीत गाजवतात मैदानी गर्दी समोरची संमेलनं. कविता ही आवाजाला शोभणाऱ्या भडक भराऱ्या टाळून सौम्य रंगात माफक मनोरम परिणाम साधणाऱ्या. हातातल्या पाईपशी खेळत कवी वाचतो एक कविता स्वतःच्या वेगवेगळ्या पाईप विषयी. माझ्या पुढे बसलेले चष्मेवाल्याने ठेवलाय बाजूच्या खुर्चीवर डनहिलच्या पाकिटाखाली टाइम्स लिटररी सप्लिमेंटचा ताजा अंक. बाहेर मंत्रालयावर जाणाऱ्या मोर्चानी वाचनात येतो काही काळ व्यत्यय. कवी त्रासतो, म्हणून जन्मजात सभ्यतेनं येऊ देत नाही त्याचा प्रत्यय. कार्यक्रम संपतो, श्रोत्यांना वाटतं अतिशय समाधान की क्षीण होणाऱ्या एका भाषिक संस्कृतीला मिळालाय उजाळा, निदान एका दुपारापुरतं या अवाढव्य अशांत अराजकी उपखंडाच्या एका कडेला. The poem is poetry reading Bombay/Mumbai. In Marathi it is Mumbai. And that's where we start looking at the issues that I'm going to raise. 27 men and women seated upon steel chairs under the benevolent eye of Madame Blavatsky hung upon the wall. Kurta and jeans, sleeveless arms, most of them between the range of Cuff Parade and Malabar Hill. The senior Indo-English poet of the city introduces the visiting British poet in soft words, and who then rises and begins to read his poems with heavy eyelids, interpolating gossipy talk between poems expertly. Fist on chin, female faces listen intently. The poet reads in low, measured tones, and to think of those vernacular poets having a field day with their strident voices and extravagant gestures at Sammelan in crowded Maidan. Playing with the pipe in his hand, the poet reads a poem of his various pipes. The bespectacled gentleman in front of me has kept latest issue of TLS near him beneath a packet of Dunhills. Outside, the morcha marching towards Mantralaya disturbs the reading. The poet is annoyed, but with true gentlemanliness controls his emotions consummately. A young Parsi woman proposes a vote of thanks and the program ends. The audience is gratified that a certain language culture growing weak here has received a boost, at least for an afternoon, on the edge of this vast, unquiet, anarchic subcontinent. The Marathi poem is by Vilas Sarang and the translation is also by Vilas Sarang. So you have a poem and a translation by the poet himself. So one of the questions that I will be looking at in this paper is the question of why does a poet need to translate himself or herself? Poem and its translated version raise several critical questions for the notion of communities and communication in contemporary Maharashtra. For instance, why does a poet translate himself or herself? Who is the audience of Marathi version and who is the audience of its English version? What is the relation between the anglicized, elite, urban and cosmopolitan audience and the Marathi-speaking audience, which is not necessarily the urban and anglicized audience? Though these two communities are not homogeneous, they are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Furthermore, what kind of asymmetry between these two spaces exists, and what are the problems of communication between these two spaces? Can we say that both these spaces are part of a certain Marathi space that is heterogeneous, asymmetrical, and historical? The figures like Vilas Sarang, 1942 to 2015, seem to occupy boundaries and peripheries of both these spaces, continuously translating themselves between both the spaces. Vilas Sarang's location as a writer has shaped his literary sensibility and influenced his ambivalent insider-outsider presence in Marathi, Indian and global literary culture. Being neither a Savarna nor a Dalit, but belonging to the non-Brahmin Bhandari caste from Malvan, the in-between OBC caste, and we were talking about in-between spaces. Now this space, when it comes to sociology of literature, is also underexplored. Means when we think of caste in Maharashtra, we think of Dalit and Brahmin. But 80% of the society, which is composed of the other caste, how to bring that complexity in our reading of literature is one question that Vilas Sarang has dwelt upon extensively in his book, Marathi Sahitya and Zaat Vastav. But he could discuss it because he himself comes from the same space. He is neither a typical diaspora writer, though he studied at Bloomington, Indiana in 1971 to 74 and teaching in Iraq 1974 to 79 at the University of Basra and Kuwait University 1991 to 2002, nor being a typical homegrown writer. So he doesn't occupy a space that is very common in the identity and politics in India, or Indian literary culture. And being someone who has read, researched and written extensively in two languages, allowed him to think outside the stereotypical academic boxes as well as the pervasive identitarian politics at multiple levels, which made him a marginal as well as an outsider figure at all these levels. Thus, translation in general and self-translation in particular can be understood as a trope for negotiating this complex cultural predicament. Giving an upper branch of Cartesian proposition, Vilas Sarang said, "I translate myself, therefore I am." Like Tagore, Beckett, Dilip Chatre, Sarang translated his own poems and short stories along with the works of numerous other writers like B.S. Murdekar, W.H. Auden, Bhalchandra Nemade, as well as Old English poems, Anglo-Saxon poems like The Seafarer and The Wanderer. His collection of English poems, A Kind of Silence and Another Life, contains many of his poems in translation from his Marathi collections like Kavita, 1969 to 1984, from which I have read this poem, and Ghartya Itihasachi Varu, 2009. His collection of short stories in English titled The Women in the Cages has many of his short stories in translation from his Marathi collection Soledad 1975, Atank 1999, and Chirantanacha Gandha. The date is not clear here. He has also reflected on translation as a practice in his doctoral thesis, The Stylistics of Literary Translation, 1988, which was translated into Marathi as Bhashantarani Bhasha by A.N. Pednekar, and in his book Aksharancha Shrama Kela. In his essay Self-Translators in 1981, he departs from the general negative outlook towards self-translation, as we find in Sujit Mukherjee's very famous essay on Tagore's translation as perjury. Vilas Sarang takes a positive view of self-translation. He discusses the world-renowned self-translators like Beckett, Tagore, and Nabokov. This phenomena, according to Sarang, problematizes the conventional understanding of translation. He notes that self-translation is not merely imitation, but a creation and stands in its own right, and it blurs the distinction between the original and translated. Discussing the idea that self-translator can claim far greater freedom, and one can in fact adversely criticize a self-translation for not taking sufficient liberties with the source text. He points out that the motives behind self-translation are more complex than the desire for fame or reward by reaching out to larger audience. Sarang says that for a bilingual creative writer, writing a poem in only one language is an incomplete process. And self-translation often implies reassuring oneself that the poem exists. To self-translate is to reconcile self and anti-self. And this is where he quotes Descartes' famous quotation, I translate myself, therefore I exist. Sarang has said that bilingualism can leave you in a tricky situation. Marathi readers have frequently complained that my Marathi sounds as though it was translated from English. And I dare say they are not entirely off the mark. At the same time, whenever I have written directly in English, there are sometimes complaints that it doesn't sound quite English. It can be the unenviable fate of a bilingual writer to be turned away from both the houses he considers his own, he says. As Sarang notes, the English idiom of a bilingual writer is often seen as not being English enough, and a Marathi idiom is perceived as being anglicized and hence inauthentic. And this results in dual alienation of a bilingual writer. This predicament of dual alienation is an important context for analysis of translations made by these authors, like Kolatker, for instance, Chitre, and others. One can approach Sarang's self-translations of poems in another light, that's the name of his collection, as well as translation of other writers in light of his own ideas on translation, in the context of his larger critical preoccupations of modernism and tradition, urban cosmopolitan creativity, and a very controversial non-Dalit, non-Savarna perspective on literary history of 20th century Marathi, which if I get time then I may just discuss some part of it. I have attempted to situate Sarang's ideas in the historical context of modern Marathi culture. For that, I have used theorization by two people. One is the theory of additive bilingualism as promoted by Lambert, where he has argued that bilingualism can be of two kinds. It can be of many kinds, but two largely come. And those two kinds are, one is subtractive bilingualism, where when you acquire a language, you lose on one language you already have. And the other is additive bilingualism, where your knowledge of one language helps you to acquire the second language in a better way, and it enriches both the languages. So these are the two kinds of bilingualisms according to Lambert. In the past 60 years, the bilingual writers like Arun Kolatker, Chitre, Sarang, Gauri Deshpande, and Kiran Nagarkar have played a considerable role in establishing modernism in Marathi literature and Indian writing in English as well. Bilingualism also seems to be related to the phenomena of displacement and migration, which has received great deal of attention in the case of Indian English diaspora writers, but has not been adequately mapped in the case of Bhasha writers. There was a vicious attack. Yeah, I will just very quickly talk about a vicious attack on bilingual imagination from nativism and nationalism, which led to subsequent marginalization of authors like Sarang and Nagarkar. And a typical attack is Bhalchandra Nemade's reading of Arun Kolatkar's poetry. Nemade compares Kolatkar's Marathi poem Irani and its English version, Irani Restaurant Bombay, made by the poet himself. Kolatkar calls it a version of his own work. Nemade asks whether the linguistic medium decides and influences the individual style of a bilingual poet, and concludes that English language determines poet's literary style. The poem in his first language is more authentic one. The inauthenticity of the bilingual poet, according to Nemade, stems from striking blockage in perception of the bilingual poet and his inability to enter into the geology of the word. So to say, the age-old reasons for words to exist in a particular language. The volcanic power of Kolatkar's Marathi word order and syntax becomes mere craftsmanship in English. The variety of registers that is quite astonishing in Kolatkar's Marathi poems do not appear in his English poems. And then he goes on to level the familiar charges against Kolatkar by saying that he provides a colonial tourist view of India and playing to foreign gallery. He charges Kolatkar for making fun of India's dilapidated traditions, poverty and ugliness. He also accuses Kolatkar for deliberately trying to alienate himself, and that an alien language is more conducive to his determination to alienate himself.
Wow.
Nemade laments that it's deplorable that the values of the Indo-Anglican poets are not shaped by their first culture, much less by their own language. So Sarang says in this view of regressive mood of Marathi literature and the rise of phenomena called nativism is probably not surprising. Ironically, its leader, the novelist Bhalchandra Nemade, one-time avant-garde writer, tradition breaker of the novel Kosla, with the practitioners of rural literature as his followers, have accused Chitre Kolatkar and myself of being a slave of Western culture. He goes on to launch a very sustained critique of Nemade, and more recent one is his essay that she was talking about Lekhakacha Lekhak Rao Ka Hoto. So to which he has written an article saying Lekhak Rao Nemade, where he reviews his book of interviews. So this is for the first time that he says that somebody has developed interview as a literary genre. And out of 49 interviews, there are 15 interviews. And he goes on to analyze one page of Nemade's typical interviews. And that's devastating. First problem with Nemade's argument, I don't have time to talk about it, but very quickly I will summarize. The first problem of Nemade's argument is that he starts with a translated version, treats it as if it's original, and then complains that it's not like the original at all. The translated text is always a different text from the source, and hence complaining that it's not like the source text is merely tautological. Nemade should know that in translation, the content, the style of the original cannot be simply transposed across linguistic, cultural, and aesthetic differences and contexts, and that evaluation of either the source or translated text based on values from one culture to another is fallacious. I will just skip this, and then I have discussed bilingualism and nativism, and one of the theoretical frames that I've been using is developed by Yuri Lockman, and Lee was talking about the prison house of monolingualism. So in the peripheries of the West, not maybe in America, you find a theory which is multilingual. In fact, Lockman is talking about meaning itself as a product of a multilingual space.
Wow.
So that's a very radical position, and he seems to imply that all spaces are heterogeneous. So to say that West is monolingual itself can be a fallacy. Yeah? So I'm using Lockman's framework to look at, one of very interesting concept that Lockman develops is the idea of auto-communication, where a usual Jacobsonian model of self-communication is communication is between self and the other. He talks about how communication of one person with oneself is also a typical speech act. And he develops a theory of culture based on the idea of self-communication, as if implying that all communication is ultimately self-communication, where culture itself is talking to itself. In my paper, I have looked at the whole question of self-translation as an example of auto-communication, which means that this is the process which also produces a sense of who you are. It's not just a merely strategy that Sarang is using to survive in this literary politics of marginalization, but it's a cultural phenomena which in fact constructs traditions and self-identity. So that's my larger argument. So I want to stop here for the lack of time, and if there are questions, I will be happy to. Thank you.